Hi folks, welcome back to Lonely Horde Guitars. I am in the middle of doing the binding for the 6-pack, and I wanted to do a little video about how I handle wood binding. So how do I get from this to this? Let's get started. Next step, we need to figure out how deep to make our cuts. So, or wide actually is a better word to use. So we've got a little bit of koa binding here and some rosewood, and I think this is sapele, and we are about 130 thousandths. If we do the binding alone, we are in the mid 50s. So that will go into how we set up the bearings on our router. So we're going to cut this with basically a bearing bit that is adjustable. So I've gone ahead and I've got a variety of different bearings with different sizes, and I've gone ahead and pre-done the math here of like what size ledge I end up with when I use these bearings. So in this case, our binding itself was about 55, so I'm going to go with like a 60 thousandths ledge, and all together we ended up with about 130 thousandths, so we're going to just check the one for 130 thousandths ledge. We go ahead and swap out that bearing. And there's a couple other parts here I want to sort of draw attention to. These bearings themselves, okay, so let's grab our 160. Let's grab our 60, because that's the cut we're going to do first. They are offset. So this is pretty flat, this is recessed. If I put my bearing on here, then, oops, I need my little washer here. If I put my bearing on here with the recessed side, then my cutting surface is very close to my bearing. And this is what we want to do for our first pass. This is going to be for the binding itself. And then on the second pass, we're going to push the bearing out because we don't want to drop into the cut that we already did for the binding. And so in that case, we will put on this little brass fitting here, which pushes it out a little bit, and then we will use the flush side to push our bearing out even further. And notice how we get like a large gap between the bearing and the cutting surface, and we will use that for the cut that gives us the depth that we need for the purfling and binding together. Now here's sort of the second half of how all this works. We need to set the depth of our router. So this router rests in this router base, which basically slides up and down on the sides of the guitar. There's bearings here so that it can move easily, and then it's got this plastic bushing here that rides against the top of the guitar. And this is why we do the binding cut first. If we were to do the purfling cut first, it's not quite wide enough to support us well on the edge anymore and might fall into the purfling gap and then not give us a good cut for the binding. So we do the binding first, then we do the binding and purfling combined, but we need to set the height of this. So we've got it in here, we're going to spin this up, and my binding is like 285 thousandths. So we want to, I've gone ahead and zeroed this when it's flat, and we want to just give us a little bit of buffer there, maybe another little swipe. So now we should be doing a cut about 1/4 inch. And we can sort of just eyeball it just to make sure that we've got plenty of room. We could probably come up just a hair. Yeah. All right. So that's 260 over 285. So it's going to just leave a little bit, about 15 to 20 thousandths above the edge of the guitar, which we will then sand down. Next step is mounting the guitar in this little cradle. So we will use this. It is adjustable, both inside like this and then up and down. And what we want to do is we want to adjust it so that our sides are perpendicular to the cuttings, or perpendicular to the sled's base. So right now we are jacked up a little bit in the back, so we will lower that. And what this does is it gives us a nice flat cut. So we want the bearing to be riding nice and flat and cut nice and flat against the sides, so our binding goes in nice and flat. If the side is cranked out like this, then the bearing's going to be pushed out farther than the cutting surface. If we're tilted like this, then we are going to cut too deep because the bearing's going to be pushed in farther than the cutting surface. So we want a nice perpendicular, and we still need to come down a little bit. See how that is. That looks good on that side. And we look good on this side. We'll check. I usually check around the waist, and then maybe, you know, a couple spots on the upper and lower bout. And we need to tilt, I think, a little bit in this direction. Now sometimes wood moves. Really? Never heard that. So occasionally, no matter how good a job I do or try to do, my sides aren't 100% perpendicular all the way around. And I have to do this in multiple passes. So I'm looking pretty good at various points, but then I might have to go cut those and then come back, adjust, and then do other passes. In this case, it looks like I'm going to have to do it. We are a little bit of a trapezoid coming in on the top. So whereas my necks looks good and my lower bout looks good up through about there, as I get closer to the waist, I'm tilted in a little bit. And so what I'm going to have to do is I'll go ahead and cut as adjusted here and then here, and then come back, adjust for each waist, and then do those cuts here and here. So this one's going to be about 3 passes for the top. I don't know how the back will probably be similar, but just, you know, opposite adjustment. All right, we've got our nice ledge. Our binding fits in there nicely. That's going to look lovely. Let's go ahead and do the exact same thing to the back. I won't do that one on camera. All right, we're back to our router. We have swapped out our bearing. We used the bushing here that pushes the bearing farther away from the cutting surface. In this case, the bearing is actually flat on both sides, so it didn't really matter. It was always going to be pushed out. It wasn't recessed like some of these bigger bearings are. We'll tighten that down, and then we will go and set our cutting height to a little bit less than the 1/16 or so that we've got for our purfling. So that ultimately it will be just a little bit proud of the surface, and then we can sand that down. All right, everything's cut. We've basically got a nice ledge here for our binding and a nice ledge for our purfling. It's time to bend stuff. So I start off, just soak the binding and purfling and let it pick up the water a little bit, spread it out, make sure it's nice and good and soaked. Down here, probably a little bit off camera, I have a bunch of masking tape already sort of ripped off and ready to go. Now I have bent this using my bending machine in the past, and what I found is just bending it on the guitar actually works a lot better for me. When you use the bending machine, what you get is a bend that matches what the guitar theoretically is, but not once it's been totally assembled and glued down and moved around and so forth. So it doesn't really match perfectly anyways. I'm going to end up wet sanding this guitar, so it doesn't matter if it gets a little damp here and there. And now when I bend, I'm going to bend to what my guitar actually is. So let's get started. I start at the end, the tail, and give myself a little bit of overlap. And then I just work around it, taping occasionally. And this is very similar to what we're going to do with the glue once it becomes time to glue up. But here we just want to conform it to the shape of the guitar so that when it dries, we have a nice bent piece of wood. Now I do this before I've cleaned up any strands and stuff on the ledge themselves. So there'll be a little bit of sanding that happens afterwards because the moisture will raise the grain itself. So I don't want to clean it up and then have to clean it up again. So this is a dreadnought. The waist is not a particularly tough bend on the dreads. That upper bout curve is significantly worse. This was a jumbo or an OM, then you really got to pay attention in the waist. You want to make sure that you're pressed down against the ledge. This is a radiused back and top, so you're not just doing this curve, you're actually doing a little bit of this curve too, and I think that one's the harder one because that just doesn't move very well with a 1/4 inch piece of wood. And this is our toughest bend here. If you just ease into it, should be just fine once it's wet and at this thickness. Make sure you don't cross anything or get anything jammed up underneath there. Check to see that we're nice and snug everywhere. We are pressed down against the ledge. And we're looking pretty good. That needs to come down a little bit tighter. Okay, so now we're just going to let that dry and then work our way around. Binding is one of those hurry up and wait kind of tasks on guitars. A lot of waiting for things to get done. All right, we'll be back in a bit. And we're back. It's been a few hours later. I did the other sides binding. And before I take the tape off, there's a couple things that I want to do. I want to make some marks so that it's easier for me to line things up as I'm going forward. So the first mark I want to do here is where the binding is going to end on the tailpiece. And that is going to be just slightly off center because there will be a little bit of purfling that goes up in the middle here. So slightly off center gives me about right here. That's where we're going to cut that. Do the same on the other side. I also usually about the waist, just where I've got an open space, I'll put a mark so I know where kind of the line up. And then finally back at the front, I'm going to do this cut once it's glued on here. So this is just getting rid of the bulk of the extra, but we're going to fine tune this when we actually get around to it. Tape is all removed. Next step is we just want to go through and clean up any kind of stranding or bumping that might prevent a nice clean seat on this. So now we don't want to really change the profile in any drastic way. We're just kind of trying to knock off, you know, any stray threads of wood. So I'm using like 320 grit, just a soft run through here. We don't want to round off anything. Because some of the purfling we're using is rosewood, which is sort of an oily tropical wood kind of thing, we're going to take a little acetone and clean it first before we try gluing it. That'll get a lot of the oils off of it and it'll glue better. That's sort of just a general hint for these kind of oily woods. Now it's almost go time. So got a bunch of masking tape all prepped. I'm going to take just a cut off piece of binding here and I'm going to tape it where I want the new binding to stop, which is just a little bit left of the center line, so that we've got room for a little bit of purfling that's going to go up like this. Now we start the gluing. So I'm just using Titebond Original here, and I've got a stick to spread some glue and a paper towel for when I make a mess. Basically just want to glue in. So we'll spread some glue along the ledge that we cut earlier. Try not to get too much on the top, though you can always clean it up. We'll probably stop talking here because this is one of those, once you start doing the task, don't get distracted, don't stop, or else you're going to have a mess to clean up. dry spots. Try and get the bulk of the over goop off. All right, now the next thing is our middle purfling is our rosewood, so we're going to go ahead and glue both sides of that. That's really what I need the paper towel for, because I'll spread that out with my fingers. Now we get going. We're doing pretty much the same thing that we did when we bent everything. Oops. Clip. All right, no inspection. Make sure that we are nice and tight on all our seams. Looks like this could use a little bit more pressure. All right, now, and I'll do this off camera, I'm going to do the same thing on this one for the back, and then we're going to let it dry, and we'll come back for the next steps. Tape's been all removed. There are a few things that need to be cleaned up before we go further. So I usually run my purfling just a little bit longer so that I can cut it nice and flush with the binding. So that needs to happen here and here. On the next side here, we need to trim this to about here. This does not have to be particularly clean or exact. There can be gaps and so forth, because this is going to be replaced. The dovetail actually is going to cut out a section about like that. And so that's all even going to be gone. Down here, this will be covered up by the heel. So this part does not need to necessarily be particularly clean, but you will see it here. So we need to do a nice job of making this joint lined up. So we're going to do a little bit of purfling right there, and we're going to make a nice clean cut right there. This little knot is going to be obscured, but this part is not. So we're going to run a little purfling and be all good. So let's get going on that. So I am lined up along the center line here, and I'm just going to use a straight edge to help me keep my utility knife cut clean. Now, Got it where I want it. Kind of hard to get this in a position where the camera sees it well and I see it well. All right, one down, 3 more to go. So now with all that stuff cleaned up, we're ready for our next steps. And I run a little piece of purfling up and then in from the top or bottom. So I've cut the tailpiece, one right here, and sort of getting them in there so that you can check fit is rather finicky. As soon as you touch it, it's going to move unless you actually glue it in. So in this case, I'm pretty confident that I've got this piece to the size that I want. So I am just going to put a little bit of glue in there, and that'll hold that down while I work on the next little tiny piece. And we'll spread it around here a little bit. All right. Now next piece needs to be, you know, about yay long, but with that 45 on it. So I use just a little craft utility knife to make these kinds of cuts. And let's see how well we did. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. Okay, so let's put a little more glue in there. You really got to be careful with these tiny pieces too, because boy, if you drop them, they just disappear. All right. Now it looks a little sloppy here, but as it gets squeezed by that next chunk of binding and sanded, it will all come together. We just need it to hold steady for a little while. I'm going to do the exact same thing here and up the front at the bottom of the heel, but I will go ahead and do that off camera. Tape is all removed, everything's dried. We can see our little purfling bits at the end here. I did change plan a little bit and just ran this directly into the other side here. This I just snipped off because this is all going away as talked about. Here it doesn't look too bad. I may have to do a little bit of touch up in here once I sand it down and see what I'm really working with. I may have to cut this piece out a bit or do something in there with a little bit of fill. So next bit is to sand it down, or get it even with the various surfaces. I will sometimes use the powered sanders to do this, but never getting down to the actual top or back. I have spent too much time trying to get out swirl marks that, like, I only use powered tools for sanding up to a certain point, and then after that I'm back down to hand stuff, just an old-fashioned wooden block. So I'll probably go at this with the powered puppy here and get it pretty close to the surface, and then I'll come at it with 150 and 220 to finish it up. Now, I'm not going to do that on camera because that's really boring. I will also even up the sides. That's some places we've got a little bit of sticking out, and that needs to be brought in to make the sides even again. And I'll be back when that's all done. And after a bit of sanding, here is our sapele 12 string with koa binding. So, as traditional, let's give it a little squirt. See what kind of color we get. Oh, that's going to be lovely. Yeah. So if this is the kind of content you like, please like, subscribe, and we'll see you at the next one.